Committee will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. With the President's budget request released just earlier today, this is our first opportunity to explore this request and the major implications for key defense missions. I think it is fitting that the first area we will dive into is cyber. This is an increasingly important domain of warfare and an area where we have increased our emphasis on overseeing the Department's progress in building and maintaining cyber forces to protect, defend, maintain, and when necessary, conduct offensive operations in cyberspace. As we move towards developing the fiscal year 2018 NDAA, I have made cyber and cyber warfare one of my main priorities. In the coming weeks, Chairman Mac Thornberry and I, in addition to my ranking member Jim Langevin and the HASC ranking member Adam Smith, plan to introduce standalone cyber warfare legislation that strengthens congressional oversight of sensitive military cyber operations, including mandating prompt notifications to Congress in the event of unauthorized disclosures. We look forward to continuing to work with U.S. Cyber Command and the Department of Defense as we finalize this draft legislation to ensure such notifications are responsive to our needs, but without adding undue reporting burdens on the Department of Defense. In addition to our focus on strengthening congressional oversight in the area of cyber warfare, other key focus areas will include provisions to strengthen our own cyber warfare capabilities and provisions that enhance our international partnerships across the globe. In order to more thoroughly understand all of these issues, I would like to welcome our witness today, Admiral Mike Rogers, who serves as the Commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the Director of the National Security Agency. Let me now recognize Ranking Member Jim Langevin for any opening comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Admiral Rogers. I want to thank you for testifying before us today. It's always a pleasure to have you before the subcommittee, and thanks for bringing along a crowd. It makes a little more of an interesting hearing. So the President's budget for fiscal year 2018 was delivered just this morning, as the Chair stated, and so I look forward to hearing about priority investments in cyber and about any potential new legislative initiatives relating to cyber. Last year, Congress passed legislation establishing U.S. Cyber Command as its own unified combatant command. This subcommittee worked diligently on the underlying legislation because we recognize the importance of a trained and ready force able to conduct effective cyber operations in concert with other military and U.S. government efforts, consistent with the appropriate legal authorities and policies. In the FY17 NDAA also formalized the relationship with the Principal Cyber Advisor to ensure advocacy and oversight of the command. We also provided U.S. Cyber Command with limited cyber peculiar acquisition authorities 2 years ago, and I'd like to acknowledge the thoughtfulness by which the Department has implemented this authority. Today, I look forward to hearing about where these two initiatives stand, both the process by which necessary resources are being transferred from STRATCOM to Cybercom, and the new resources being provided as necessary for effective implementation. Clearly, we've made progress employing military cyber operations over the years. We've been building the cyber mission force, but now we must make sure that they're ready and stay ready for a threat that morphs on a daily basis. The persistent training environment, of course, is key to that end. Although the cyber domain is not new, there's still much that we're learning, and we must leverage those lessons learned. We must assess the force we are building, how we employ it in order to ensure Cybercom is postured correctly, and if the tools and capabilities are the best that we can provide them. So next week, I'm going to be traveling to NATO, the NATO Cyber Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence to attend its annual conference in Tallinn, Estonia. I expect that CyCon will provide extraordinary insight on how our NATO allies view the cyber domain and how international law are applicable. And it will provide me with insight on how we can increase cyber collaboration against Russian aggression. Admiral, I'd also appreciate your views on how we may strengthen collaboration with our NATO allies. So in closing, I just want to echo what the Chair said about the importance of formalizing notifications to Congress of sensitive cyber military operations. The Cyber Quarterly Brief provides us a forum to oversee cyber operations, and I was especially pleased with the participation of the Joint Staff and OSD at the last engagement. However, in our oversight capacity, I believe that we must work with the Department to obtain timelier, more standard notifications, as the Chair mentioned, and I know that we're going to work toward that end. So with that, I thank you, Admiral Rogers, for appearing today. Thank you for what you're doing at NSA and U.S. Cyber Command, and with that, I will yield back.
Thank you, Jim. I also would like to remind members that immediately following this open hearing, the committee will reconvene upstairs in 2337 for a closed classified roundtable discussion with our witness. Admiral Rogers, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stefanik, Ranking Member Langevin, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for your enduring support and the opportunity today to talk about the hardworking men and women of the United States Cyber Command. I look forward to discussing the command's posture and welcome the opportunity to describe how U.S. Cyber Command conducts efforts in the cyberspace domain and supports the nation's defense against sophisticated and powerful adversaries. The Department of Defense recognized 7 years ago that the nation needed a military command focused on cyberspace. U.S. Cyber Command and its subordinate elements have been given the responsibility to direct, operate, secure, and defend the Department's systems and networks, which are fundamental to the execution of all DoD missions. The Department and the nation also rely on us to build ready cyber forces and to be prepared to employ them when significant cyber attacks against the nation's critical infrastructure require DoD support. The pace of international conflict and cyberspace threats has intensified over the past few years. Hardly a day has gone by during my tenure at Cyber Command that we have not seen at least one significant cybersecurity event occurring somewhere in the world. This has consequences for our military and our nation at large. We face a growing variety of advanced threats from actors who operate with ever more sophistication and precision. At U.S. Cyber Command, we track state and non-state adversaries as they continue to expand their capabilities to advance their interest in and through cyberspace and try to undermine the United States' national interests and those of our allies. Conflict in the cyber domain is not simply a continuation of kinetic operations by digital means. It is unfolding according to its own logic, which we continue to better understand. And we're using this understanding to enhance the Department's and the nation's situational awareness and to manage risk in the cyber arena. I'd also look forward to updating you on our initiatives and plans to help do that. Our 3 lines of operation are to provide mission assurance for DoD operations and defend the Department of Defense information environment, to support Joint Force Commander objectives globally, and to deter or defeat strategic threats to U.S. interests and critical infrastructure. We conduct full-spectrum military cyberspace operations to enable actions in all domains, ensure U.S. and allied freedom of action in cyberspace, and deny the same to our adversaries. Defense of DoD information networks remains our top priority, of course, and that includes weapon systems and their platforms, as well as data. To execute our missions, I requested a budget of approximately $647 million for fiscal year 18, which is nearly a 16% increase from fiscal year 17, due to additional funding for Cyber Command's elevation per the fiscal year 17 NDAA, building out cyber mission force and cyber-specific capabilities and tools, and JTF Ares support in the fight against ISIS. We're completing the build-out of the cyber mission force with all teams scheduled to be fully operational by the end of fiscal year 18, and with the help from the services, continually increase cyber mission force readiness to hold targets at risk. Your strong and continued support is critical to the success of the Department in defending our national security interests in cyber. As you well know, I serve as both Commander of United States Cyber Command and Director of the National Security Agency. This dual-hat appointment underpins the close partnership between Cyber Command and NSA, a significant benefit right now in cyberspace operations. The institutional arrangement between these 2 organizations, however, will evolve as Cyber Command grows to full proficiency in the near future. The National Defense Authorization Act and a separate provision also describe conditions for splitting the dual-hat arrangement, which can only happen without impairing either organization's effectiveness and ability to execute their missions. This is another provision I've publicly stated I support, pending the attainment of certain critical conditions. Cyber Command will also engage with this subcommittee on several other matters related to the enhancement of the command's responsibilities and authorities in the coming year. This would include increasing cyber manpower, enhancing the professionalization of the cyber workforce, building defensive and offensive capability and capacity, and developing and streamlining our acquisition processes. These are critical enablers for cyberspace operations in a dynamically changing global environment. And most or all of these particulars have been directed in recent NDA acts. Along with the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy and the Joint Staff, we'll talk with you and your staffs to iron out the implementation details of that legislation. The men and women of Cyber Command are proud of the roles that we play in our nation's cyber efforts and are motivated to accomplish our assigned missions overseen by the Congress, particularly this subcommittee. We work to secure and defend DoD systems and networks, counter adversaries, and support national and joint warfighting objectives in and through cyberspace. The command's operational successes have validated concepts for creating cyber effects on the battlefield and beyond. Innovations are constantly emerging out of operational necessity, and the real-world experiences and meeting the requirements of national decision makers and joint force commanders continues to mature our operational approaches and effectiveness over time. At the same time, I realize cybersecurity is a national security issue. It requires a whole-of-nation approach that brings together both public and private sections of our society. Our Point of Partnership program in Silicon Valley and Boston has proven to be a successful initiative to link our command to some of the most innovative minds from industry, working together on cybersecurity as we face 21st century threats together in the private and public sectors. This, combined with agile policies, decision-making processes, capabilities, and command and control structures, will ensure that Cyber Command attains its potential to counter our adversaries. The men and women of U.S. Cyber Command thank you and appreciate your continued support as we confront and overcome the challenges facing us. We understand that a frank and comprehensive engagement with Congress not only facilitates the support that allows us to accomplish our mission, but also helps ensure that our fellow citizens understand and endorse our efforts, which are executed on their behalf. I've seen the growth in our command's size, budget, and mission, and that investment of resources, time, and effort is paying off. And more importantly, it's helping them to keep Americans safer in the cyber arena, but not only in cyberspace, but in other domains as well. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue across the command and its progress with you in this hearing today and over the months to come. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Admiral Rogers. We now turn to questions. First, I want to thank you for your service and your leadership. My first question is very broad. Last year's NDAA directed the elevation of Cyber Command to a full combatant command. What steps need to happen before the changes to the Unified Command Plan take effect?
So first, the Secretary of Defense and the President need to make a decision. The Secretary of Defense making a recommendation, the President ultimately making the decision as to the timing and the process we'll use. And that process is ongoing, and I don't want to speak for the Secretary or the President, but I know that that process and that discussion is ongoing. Given the language in the NDAA and in anticipation of this possibility, we've spent much of the last year working our way through the specifics of how we would do that. And if a decision is ultimately approved, we're prepared to apply that and to do it in a timely manner in accordance with the direction in terms of the timeline provided to us via the President and the Secretary of Defense.
What are the specifics, as you said, you're assessing the specifics you would do to take action? What are they specifically?
If I could, until we have an ultimate decision, I'd rather not get ahead of my leadership, because I think I owe them that, and to get into the how, if that would be all right, ma'am.
Part of your responsibilities that we enshrined in Section 923 of FY17 NDAA when we elevated Cybercom to the full combatant command involved development of doctrine and tactics related to cyber. What role do you have in advocating for or driving doctrinal development for the individual services when it comes to cyber?
So as the senior operational commander in cyber in the department, it's the partnership between that cyber team, if you will, and our fellow operational commanders and policymakers that help shape. So what is the doctrine that should shape how we employ this capability that the department's developing? If you look at what we've done over the course of the last year, the efforts against ISIS, things we're doing against other real-world challenges, they are shaping the way we're looking at how do we build the force of the future, what are the concepts for its employment If you go back a couple of years, for example, I can remember a year ago, 2 years ago, one of our fundamental concepts was we are always going to deploy forward in full teams. One of the things we found with practical experiences, we can actually deploy in smaller sub-elements, use reach-back capability, the power of data analytics. We don't necessarily have to deploy everyone. We can actually work in a much more tailored, focused way, optimized for the particular network challenge that we're working. We're actually working through some things using this, for example, out in the Pacific at the moment.
A few weeks ago in your testimony in front of SASC, you were asked your opinion about whether we should be considering the establishment of a cyber service. And at that time, you said that you were not a proponent. Could you explain a bit more as to why you feel that way?
So, the reason I'm not and I certainly understand others have a different view. The reason I'm not a proponent of that is my concern is if we are not careful, we will view cyber as this very technical, very specialized, very narrow mission set. And my view is cyber fits within a broader context. And if you want to be successful in the ability to achieve outcomes within the cyberspace arena, you need to understand that broader context. And I'm afraid that if we go the service route, we will tend to generate incredibly technically proficient, but very narrowly focused operators. And one of my takeaways from being a member of the Department of Defense for the last 36 years is we are best optimized for outcomes when our workforce has a much broader perspective. And I also think back, because I'm a big fan of history, I think back to the dialogue in the 1980s when I first joined, was first commissioned in the military. In the aftermath of the failure at Desert One and the effort to rescue those U.S. hostages being held in the embassy in Tehran, we had a lot of dialogue about, is SOF so specialized, so poorly understood by the broad conventional part of the military, so needing of specific attention that we should create a separate SOF service. We ultimately decided that the right answer was to create a joint warfighting construct. Thus, in 1987 was born Special Operations Command. And in addition, we said that that operational entity needed to be a little uniquely structured. It not only should be a warfighter, but it should be given budget resources that enable it to not only employ capability, but to determine the operational capabilities that actually, and drive the investments that actually generate the capability. I think that that is a very effective model for us to think about for cyber and cyber command, vice just automatically transitioning to the idea of a separate service.
Thank you. My time's about to expire. I now recognize Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Elise. So, Admiral, Congress has provided Cybercom with limited cyber peculiar acquisition authority. So I want to, first of all, commend the thoughtfulness by which the provision was implemented, but can you please provide a general overview of how that authority will be executed and overseen in the command?
So as you're aware, we sat down between OSD from a policy and technical perspective and Cyber Command from an operational perspective and asked ourselves, so what's the best way to implement this acquisition authority that was granted to us by the Congress? Again, we thought SOCOM offered a good model. Cyber Command actually approached our teammates at SOCOM and said, look, you have a skill set, you have personnel who are much more proficient in this area than we, so SOCOM was kind enough to actually identify the two initial individuals that we have hired who are going to provide our acquisition oversight and certification, if you will. Those individuals were put in place just a couple months ago. The authorities are now almost all finished. What you're going to see us in starting this summer is we've identified an initial set of priorities about where we want to apply this authority in terms of acquisition, and you'll see that play out over the course of the next couple months. I just got a couple things we have to finish ironing out, but you're going to see us actually implement this over the course of the next few months in the summer.
So it has not, the authority has not been used yet?
Not yet, because there are some specific technical and oversight and control things I have to make sure are in place before we start spending the money and using this. And that'll all be finished within the next month or so, I think.
Can you speculate, just provide an example of what you think the authority may be used for?
So what I've asked is, we've already identified, for example, a series of capabilities through Cyber Command's point of partnership, we call it, out in Silicon Valley. So I already have a structure that's interacting with the private sector. Now I want to overlay this acquisition authority to actually now I actually purchase, if you will, and acquire some of that capability from the private sector that we've been talking to them about now for the last few months. So I've tried to work the requirement piece in anticipation of gaining the acquisition authority. Now that we've got that pretty much done and I overlay the acquisition authority, you're going to see us start to enter into some specific contracts, very focused on a couple specific mission sets. Defense and capability for cyber protection teams is the first area we're going to focus on.
Okay, very good. So I mentioned in my opening statement that I'm going to be attending the annual cyber conference at NATO, the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence next week. What's Cyber Command's relationship with the center and NATO? And in your opinion, how can we cooperate more closely with our NATO allies? How can that cooperation be strengthened?
So, for example, like yourself, I was just out there last June, spoke at the same conference you'll be going to next month. Every time I'm in Estonia, I spend time at this center to actually talk to them. The points I try to make to my NATO teammates are a couple-fold. First, under the NATO framework, the center represents the positions of the members of the alliance that participate in the center, not necessarily the alliance as a whole. So, for example, not all 28 nations, 29 now with Montenegro, not all 29 nations actually participate in the center. I'd like to see if we can somehow more formally tie the center to NATO's policy development, for example. I think that could really accelerate some things. Also, I'm trying, because capacity is certainly a challenge, and I'm trying to both meet our own priorities as well as help key allies in the NATO alliance. One of the things I'm interested in is I've created a partnership with European Command. We're talking about potentially placing an individual maybe in the center in the course of the next year or so to more directly link with ourselves. I'd also like to see what could we potentially do within the exercise framework that the alliance is starting to create in cyber now. I've already extended invitations to them to observe and participate in our exercise framework, but I'd like to do the same thing if I could within the NATO arena.
So you know that obviously the Congress passed the CISA, the Cyber Information Sharing legislation, and that's something obviously domestically, but also we have robust cyber threat information sharing, for example, with the Israelis. How are we doing with robust cyber threat sharing information with our NATO partners? Right
now, most cyber sharing tends to be focused in many ways on a nation-to-nation basis. That's another one of the challenges that I'm interested in with Cyber Command. How can we work that more formally, military organization to military organization? So we're doing this once and not 29 different times, as it were.
Okay, very good. Well, my time has expired. I do have additional questions, but if we don't get to a second round, I'll submit them for the record. Appreciate you getting back to me on them. But thank you, Admiral, for the work you're doing, and thanks for your service to the country. I yield back.
Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Admiral, for being here. We appreciate it. The other services, the armed services, certainly have their own cyber commands. What is Cybercom doing as far as the manning and the concept of operations, as far as having duplicative issues within those services?
So remember the way we're...
to prevent the duplication.
Yes, so the way we're structured, each of those service primary operational cyber commands is a subcomponent of U.S. Cyber Command. So whether it's Army Cyber, Coast Guard Cyber, Air Force Cyber, Fleet Cyber, MARFOR Cyber, they have an operational relationship to me. And so that's how we try to work the joint and the service piece in a very integrated way. I'm the first to acknowledge, and I was a service component commander before this job. I was the Navy's guy. I was Fleet Cyber Command. In those service structures, they are both OPCON to me in the execution of their joint responsibilities, but they also have additional service responsibilities. And I try to be the connecting glue, partnering with them, and also partnering with the service leadership to make sure that from a service and a joint perspective of the department, we're aligned and focused on priorities and outcomes.
All right, and so let's parlay that into our other federal agencies that it seems all of them certainly have a cyberspace department, so to speak. Cybercom, as far as coordinating mechanisms between other federal agencies, could you explain that a little bit, please?
So we coordinate directly, primarily, in the rest of the government with the Department of Homeland Security. That's particularly driven by the fact that one of Cybercommand's 3 missions is, if directed by the President or the Secretary of Defense, to defend critical infrastructure against acts of significant cyber consequence. We would do that in partnership with DHS. And so because of that, we're closely aligned with them. In fact, I just was talking with the team yesterday between the private sector. In the private sector, the U.S. government has designated 16 different areas. Think about finance, transportation, aviation. There's 16 different segments that the federal government has designated as critical to the nation's security, that infrastructure. We've picked one of those 16 segments to do a test case, if you will, between DHS, Cyber Command, that private sector, as well as NSA from an information and intelligence sharing. That would be the NSA role, to try to get down to execution level detail about, so how would we really do this day to day? Because my experience as a military individual has taught me I don't like to do discovery learning when I'm moving to contact against an opponent. It tends to be a high loss rate, incredibly inefficient and ineffective, often very resource intensive and much slower. So I'm interested in how can I create those relationships and exercise them now before we get into a major incident directed against one of those 16 segments.
Okay, I think time for one more question.
Sure.
Cybercom has, or I guess what is Cybercom's supporting role in Northcom, PACOM, and has the DoD codified that relationship so that if there is a incident or accident, that can be really instituted very seamlessly if such an event should happen?
So our role on the defensive side is to support and ensure the continued operation, for example, of those networks, weapon systems, and platforms that those operational commanders and others count on to execute their missions. In addition, we generate offensive capability, particularly for PACOM and other geographic commands outside the United States, because we don't really see, I don't think right now in my mind, how would we apply cyber offensive capability in the United States? That's not the role of the DoD. Our focus inside the United States would be largely defensive. One of the things, it's a focus area, I've set out a series of goals for 2017. One of those goals is increased cyber reserve and guard integration, to get to the question that you're really driving at. How do we make sure that for a domestic incident that all elements of DoD are aligned, and we all know how we're going to do this, and all the forces know what their role is going to be, the command and control is all outlined, so Northcom knows what they're going to do, I know what I'm going to do, PACOM, because they have a portion of a domestic responsibility, so that they know what they're going to do. I'd like to use the defense support to civil affairs, which has been an ongoing process we've used for decades. I'd kind of like to use that as a test model. I'm a big fan of let's use what's working elsewhere. Let's not try to create something different or unique for cyber to the maximum extent that I can.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Larson.
Thanks, Admiral, for coming. I'd like to go back to the question of the Unified Cyber Command, because your answer, I wasn't concerned about the answer, the portion of the answer is like we're still working it out. I was concerned because I thought I heard you say something that runs counter to what we told you all to do, and that is the decision's made to do this, and that the Secretary and the President don't need to make a decision to actually do a unified command. The law, as I understand,
But the time, they will drive
the timing and everything, that's something separate.
Right.
I just
So that's
wanna,
my only point, is the timing.
if
piece.
that's your only point, that's fine. I thought I heard something else.
No, I apologize if I miscommunicated. You've clearly provided a legal framework. Hey, this is what you're doing.
Okay.
You know, absent a change in the law, that's what we have to execute.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I'd like to go back as well to something the chair was exploring with you, and it has to do with the having a cyber service or not. And I don't want you to. I actually agree with you in not having one, but it does beg the question, though, to have to have that capability. What flexibility do you need in personnel? What flexibility do you need in contracting? What flexibility do you need to fully utilize and even develop a formal framework so you're using active component reserve, guard, as well as the contractor community?
So among the ways that we try to ask ourselves, so if we're going to go with a service-based approach, which is really what we're executing, how would you do it? We came up with a couple of baseline principles, if you will. The first is, it doesn't matter what your service is, and it doesn't matter if you're guard or reserve. We build to one standard. And so we have created with it a joint framework for every position within the Cyber Mission Force. We can tell you what the pay grade is, and we can tell you what the qualification standards are, and we can tell you what the duties are that are assigned to the position. Because I said, look, we've got to create one integrated force. And if we do 1,000 different variants, I can't optimize that. The second thing we said was the structure of the teams needs to be the same, regardless of whether it's a particular service, guard, or reserve. The analogy I used was, it doesn't matter if we have an F-16 squadron in the guard or in the active force. There's one squadron nomenclature for an F-16 that we can then employ anywhere globally because we know everybody's built to the same standard. Even as we acknowledge there are some variances, but everybody's built to the same standard. So that was another principle I said. The only way we can make a service-based approach work is that active or reserve, guard or reserve, it doesn't matter. We're building to one standard. If we stick to that framework, I'm very comfortable that we can make a service approach work for us. If we insist on variance, if we insist on everybody doing their own thing, then I'm the first to admit, boy, this is not a model that's going to generate the outcomes that we need. I'm the first to acknowledge that.
And the role of the private sector?
So the private sector, when I look at them, a couple of things come to mind. Number one, they're the ones who are going to provide the human capital, whether that human capital ends up wearing a uniform, whether it's part of our civilian government workforce, or it's contractor force. They all start in the private sector. So it's one of the reasons why I spend a fair amount of time as Cyber Command and as the director of NSA for that, to the same extent in some ways, with the academic world, with private industry about, so tell me how you create a workforce. What works for you? What incentives are you using? What has failed? That in hindsight you say to yourself, boy, don't go down this road because it really failed spectacularly for us. Even as I acknowledge there's a difference between government and the private sector, but I still think there are some things that we can learn from each other. In addition, I think two other areas come to mind for me with the private sector. The first is technology. The days when DOD is going to be the engine for technological innovation and change, I think, are long behind us. That's just not the DOD model. That's why we created the point of partnership in Silicon Valley and in Boston. It's why I thought the acquisition piece was so important for us. We've got to be able to tap into that private sector in terms of acquisition of technology and capability. And then the last area, which is a little bit counterintuitive in some ways, when it comes to the generation of policy, concepts, thought, the private sector can play a huge role here. I think back to the beginnings of nuclear deterrence and nuclear policy, for example. If you go back in the 1950s and you read much of the thought process, much as that was flowing from the academic world, hardly anybody remembers now that Henry Kissinger in the 1950s and early 1960s was a professor at Harvard who was writing about concepts of nuclear deterrence, nuclear employment that he and others ended up shaping the strategic vision we had. And I'd like to see us do the same thing in cyber.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Admiral Rogers, for your service and for being here today. Secretary Mattis, before he became Secretary, in talking about the Budget Control Act and sequestration, said no foe in the field could do our military as much harm as has been done to us through sequestration and the Budget Control Act. As we begin the process of looking at the 2018 budget, I'm interested to know to what extent you were able to factor in strategy and threats and sort of strategic thinking about what needs to be done as you put together the budget for Cyber Command, and to what extent you've still been hamstrung by the BCA and by those cap numbers.
So, like any entity, it's all about prioritization for us. So we spend a lot of time figuring out with finite resources, even with growth, with finite resources, how are we going to prioritize? So our input for the fiscal year 18 budget in Truth in Lending, we just rolled it out as a government, as a department this afternoon and during the midday today, so I have not yet seen the specifics yet. I know what the broad number for us is, but I haven't seen the sub-elements of that, so I'll talk broadly. I apologize, but I'll talk broadly. For the 18 input, we tried to identify those priorities. In a macro sense, in no particular order, I've been arguing manpower, investment in core capabilities, and then number 3, how can I accelerate number 1 and number 2? How can I do both of those faster? Because in some ways, even though as the WannaCrypt ransomware issue that we've been going through shows, there's capability in the department. There's a lot of motivated men and women who are doing some good work. We were not impacted by WannaCrypt, and that wasn't from a lack of effort. We had spent significant time starting in March asking ourselves, how might this play out? How do we position ourselves in the case of, because Microsoft had put out the patch for the vulnerability, we as Microsoft users saw that and started asking ourselves, how might an opponent attempt to exploit this vulnerability even as we were working to patch? It's one of the reasons why we use a defense in depth strategy. There's no one single solution. There's no one single way to fix this problem. It's layers built on top of each other. That really has been the key to our success. So we're asking ourselves, how can we do this faster? Every day, one of my biggest concerns is, and I've never really had this same viewpoint in almost 36 years of commissioned service. Every day, I literally think to myself, we are in a race to generate more capacity and more capability at the same time that I'm watching a host of global actors do the exact same thing. And so we're trying to sustain both staying up with them, but quite frankly, my objective is to get ahead of the problem set. I don't like reacting to things. It's not an effective or efficient way to do business, and I don't think that's what the nation wants from us. So until I'm able to bore into the specifics of the budget, that kind of gives you a broad sense of what I thought we needed to focus on.
So would you say, Admiral, that the budget as it's been proposed provides the resources necessary to regain superiority in areas that we've lost it?
It certainly moves us along that road, but no one should think for one moment that this mission set, not unlike some others, is going to require increased and sustained investment over time. This is not going to be, hey, 1 or 2 years, we've increased you by some reasonable number, which has been the case for the last 2 years, and that's all you're going to need. If you look at the scope of the challenges associated with this mission set and from where we're starting, we've got a lot of hard work ahead of us.
And would you talk a little bit about how you're going to measure success and how you're going to measure progress along that path of regaining superiority?
So there's a couple components to it. First, we've developed a set of, or we're in the process of developing a set of metrics. So how do we truly assess readiness for this force that we've created? We focused for the first few years on assessing initial operating capability and final operating capability. It's when you hear us talk and slang about IOC and FOC, and you heard me in my remarks. We achieved IOC essentially on time, October 2016. We have until 30 September 2018 to achieve FOC. I think we're on track for that. But one of the things I tell the team is that doesn't get to warfighting. And in the end, it's about our ability to actually operate in a sustained heavy environment. Just like when we're building a brand new carrier or a brand new fighter wing, for example. It's not enough just to say, we've got all the pilots, we've got all the parts. It's about training, it's about assessing readiness. So we're working our way through how are we gonna do that? Then it's other things like we ask ourselves, are we driving down defensive penetrations? Are we driving down malware infections? There's some specific metrics that we think that we can use that give us a sense, particularly on the defensive side, are we being more effective or not?
Thank you very much. My time's expired.
Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you. Help me understand a little bit how we make clear to other countries in the world the consequences of cyber attacks. With conventional weapons in conventional wars, there may be an understanding of what the consequences will be should one country attack another with a certain kind of weapon. What is our level of dialogue with other countries, including those countries we view as threats, including those countries who I think
Right.
we know have attacked us about what the consequences are going forward.
So if I could, in an unclassified session, I'm not going to get into specifics associated with particular nation states. And it hasn't been a one-size-fits-all approach, which is true broadly for strategy for us, I would argue, as a nation. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We try to optimize the way we're looking at this particular challenge set based on whatever the particular actor that we're dealing with. What works for one won't necessarily have the same kind of impact as what will work for another. There's a couple, first let me talk about a couple basic things. We have been very public and acknowledge the fact that we are using cyber offensively against ISIS, not just because we want ISIS to know that we are contesting them, but because, quite frankly, we also think it's in our best interest for others to have a level of awareness that we are investing in capability and we are employing it within a legal law of armed conflict framework, not indiscriminately, but we are employing it. We've also acknowledged very publicly in unclassified strategy documents, for example, for the Department of Cyberspace strategy, that we are developing offensive capability, that we believe that deterrence is an important concept that we've got to work our way through. We're trying to communicate to the world around us that we're aware of the kinds of activity we're seeing out there. Some of it we view with concern. As a result, we think it's in our own nation's best interest to have a set of capabilities that both generate greater options for our policymakers and our operational commanders, but at the same time, help communicate to others around us, you don't want to go down this road with us. I think the reaction or the way WannaCrypt played out in the United States, for example, is a very good example of that. Hey, look, in a major malware effort that took down many systems in lots of other parts of the world, did not have the same level of effectiveness here in the United States.
Let me ask you a question
Not
about
by
that.
chance.
To what degree are we treaty bound to assist an ally who is attacked through cyber, not kinetically? And are we already assisting allies who are, maybe to use that most recent example that you just gave?
So that's a bit of a legal question, and that's just not my lane, but I'll give you my thoughts from my perspective as an operational commander. We, for example, NATO has been very direct in saying that they view cyber as a natural continuation of the standing Article 5 framework, where attack against one is an attack against all. Even as NATO acknowledges, the application of Article 5 is through a decision framework in the North Atlantic Council, and it's done on a case-by-case basis, but broadly, that's the intent, and that's been communicated in multiple forms in multiple ways. For other nations, you'd have to ask somebody who's a little bit smarter about the specifics of the standing mutual defense treaties that we have.
Let me ask another question then. Sure. Because we know the Russians attacked the integrity of our elections here, because we know they've done that in other countries, because past behavior is a good predictor of future behavior, whose responsibility is it in this country? And then kind of to, maybe for the record on for our allies, when our allies' elections are attacked. But is it Cyber Command, is it DHS, is it both? Should the RNC or the DNC be attacked going forward, for example? Whose responsibility is that?
So under the current framework, which could change, but under the current framework, the Department of Homeland Security has overall responsibility for the provision of capability and capacity within the federal government in support of the private sector, broadly. Cyber Command, in its defined mission of, if directed, to, as I said, to support the defense of critical infrastructure, we would partner with DHS to do that. We would do that, Cyber Command, by attempting to interdict that activity before it ever reached that U.S. network. Quite frankly, we wouldn't focus on blue or friendly space. We'd be out in gray and red space, if we will, trying to stop the activity from ever getting
It's
done.
yours before it gets here. Once it gets here, it's DHS.
And then once simplistically, then once it gets here, DHS has created a sector framework. Cyber Command also has a set of capabilities in the form of national cyber protection teams that we would also deploy in partnership with DHS to support among those 16 specific critical infrastructure areas. Again, it's one of the things I mentioned earlier that I want to test. We're going to start using one particular sector that's a little bit more mature than some of the other 15.
Thank you.
Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Admiral Rogers. Thank you for your service to the country, and your job is so very important to us all. You stated that your first mission priority is defense of DoD information networks. Would you suggest that that means that defensive operations doctrinally will take precedence over offensive operations?
No, because I remind the team, look, we have 3 missions and we have to be capable of executing all of them. I can't go to my bosses and say, hey, I really just chose to focus on number 1. Now, don't get me wrong, like any commander, I have to prioritize. And so as I'm looking at the challenges out there, I have told the team we will prioritize against number 1, even as we acknowledge we still have to execute those other 2 missions. Yeah. But like any other operational organization, at times I have to prioritize resources, focus. But it isn't, well, it's just one and not the others. We've got to do all of them.
Yeah. Well, as you know, the DoD relies upon the civilian power grid for 99% of its power requirements, without which I'm told that it becomes impossible in CONUS to affect the DoD mission. Do your priorities include protecting the U.S. power grid and other critical infrastructure against cyber attacks?
So again, I don't have responsibility for the defense of that in the United States. I will say one of the things I'm interested to see if we can maybe look at doing differently, and I'm having this conversation in particular with Transcom at the moment. Right now, when it comes, for example, to critical infrastructure that the DoD accounts on to do its mission, when it comes to clear defense contractors who either are generating the capabilities that we use, advanced fighters, for example, and other platforms, as well as private industry, for example, for Transcom that provides services, lift, movement of cargo. Under the current structure, the Defense Security Service has overall responsibility for the interface with those private companies, not Transcom, for example, even though they work for Transcom or they provide a service based on a contractual relationship to Transcom, and not necessarily with us. I'd like to see, is there a way to bring those operational commands, Cyber Command, DSS, and that private sector together in a much more integrated way? Because what we're finding right now is I will become aware of activity, I will pass that to DSS, DSS passes that to the private sector. That doesn't come across to me always as the fastest, most efficient, most agile way to do business, and I'd like to see if we could maybe try to change that.
Well, Admiral, you know that that's been one of the challenges in the past, that sometimes, you know, the whole notion of protecting the grid from cyber security challenges is kind of walks the 13th floor of humanity, because we, in the department, your department, consider that a civilian responsibility. Of course, the civilian response is that is a national security issue and should not be our responsibility. And my fear, of course, is that neither put the sufficient focus on it necessary, and given your stated
yes, sir.
Yeah, so it's worth always touching base on. How will Cyber Command's posture improve once it's elevated? Do you believe you'll have all the resources and authorities you require to accomplish your assigned missions? And what do you expect your #1 challenge will be in terms of Russia, China, Iran, ISIS, someone else?
Okay, so let me try to unpackage them. If I forget one, please just let me know, sir. So first, what's the benefit of elevation? You know, why have I and others recommended that that's a smart course of action? Even as I acknowledge the decision's not mine, as we've already talked, that's outlined within legislation. Now it's a timing issue, absent a change to the legislation. In the department's processes, when it comes to how we develop budgets, how we articulate prioritization, how we develop broad policy, it is generally built around the idea that the combatant commanders are the primary voices for the operational end of those processes, not sub-unified commands, combatant commanders. So one of my concerns has been, we talk about the importance of cyber, and I acknowledge that there are other priorities in the department, and yet for some, not all, but for some of our processes, the cyber expertise is not embedded in the current structure because you put it one level below. So I believe that elevation plugs us more directly into the primary decision-making processes within the department, which are really optimized for combatant commanders. It also makes us faster because now I've got one less layer that I have to work through. I've been very blessed in my time as Cyber Command. The Strategic Command commanders I have worked with, General Hyten, And boy, how quickly we forget. I can picture, he was a good flag officer friend. They were great to team with because I would tell them, look, if we're going to insist everything I do flows through Offutt, I can't get to timeliness, I can't get to speed. And this helps address that.
Time has expired. I
Thank
now recognize Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Apparently, two of our colleagues have introduced a bill that would allow private sector U.S. companies to hack back active defense. I hadn't realized before that this is apparently illegal today, absent a law change. So could you reflect on this proposal and whether it's a good idea or not?
So broadly, and I only speak for Mike Rogers because I'm not in the policy lane, but I have an opinion. As an operational commander, my concern is, while there's certainly historic precedents for this, nation states have often gone to the private sector when we lacked government capacity or capability. We did that in the Revolutionary War, letters of marque. We didn't have a navy. We went to the private sector, gave them authority and protection via our government to say, go out and capture cargoes from the Royal Navy and from the British merchant fleet. My concern is, be leery of putting more gunfighters out on the street in the Wild West. As an individual tasked with protecting our networks, I'm thinking to myself, we've got enough cyber actors out there already. Just putting more out there, I'm not sure is in everybody's best interest. And I would also be concerned about the legal liability you might, and I'm not a lawyer, but the legal liability, I would think that you have some liability issues associated with taking actions with second and third order effects that you don't truly understand when you actually execute it. That's just my concern.
Are other countries doing this? Are you familiar with any other countries that have enabled their private sector to be aggressive?
There may be equivalent legal frameworks out there. I certainly not that have come to my attention and not that I've had a discussion about.
I was curious you used a gunfighter analogy because some people have thought that the NRA might set up a whole new wing of activity for this. But to the extent that private business in this country feels disconnected from government, or that, as you pointed out earlier, government response is too slow, or that certain national security interests are not recognized as being national security interests even when it's protecting the grid, I think you're probably going to see greater pressure.
Right, I would agree. In some ways, it goes back to, again, showing you my war college education. I don't want you to think as a taxpayer I didn't listen when I was sent to service colleges. In the Westphalian construct, the application of force has generally, for the last several centuries, been viewed as a mission or a right of a sovereign state, not something that the private sector does. We don't use, for example, for us, we don't use contracts to actually drop and fire weapons. We don't use mercenaries to do that. We use uniformed military. I would just be concerned that going that route, again, argues against the broad principles we've used about the role of the state in applying force kinetically or non-kinetically.
We don't use those tools, but in our degraded Westphalian system, we don't know who we're being attacked by. It might be state actors, quasi-state actors, possibly private actors. Who knows?
Although it depends on the situation, but I'm the first to acknowledge 100% attribution is probably a standard we're going to be driving for a long time and not necessarily achieve immediately.
What percentage of accuracy and attribution would you give us today?
Oh, it depends on the actor. If you take, for example, speaking now as on the NSA side, if you take a look at the efforts we did in the intelligence community assessment with respect to Russian efforts to influence the 2016 election process, really high confidence, very fine-grained attribution. If you take a look at WannaCrypt, for example, we're 10 days into this, and collectively, both the private sector and the government, we're still working our way through who's the actor or actors associated with this. So it tends to vary. There's no single concrete answer.
So with the elections, we're close to 90%, 95%, and with this, we're 60, but raising it?
I don't know. I've never really thought about it from a number.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you,
Thank you, Madam Chair. Admiral, it's a long way from Auburn University, and
War Eagle, sir.
I hope you never lose a war or win a ball game. I'm a University of Georgia graduate.
Oh, I have a brother who went to the University of Georgia and a
He's a good
sister-in-law.
man. He's a good man.
Misguided individuals.
Was he the one?
I love them, but they're
Was he
misguided.
the one holding Uggo when he bit the Auburn player? All kidding aside, thank you for your service. And we talk a lot about how fast technology changes, and the acquisition process being a problem throughout the department. But I'd like to hear your comments on the personnel. Again, you speak to this in your comments. When you get the young man, the young woman out there that's the best and the brightest, there are opportunities in the private sector versus there are opportunities in the public sector under your command. The challenges there, and the issue of what percentage of your personnel are civilian versus uniform?
Roughly, we're about 80% military, about 20% civilian. That's kind of what we're building to. It varies in some areas, but it's about 80-20.
I know we have a tremendous number of wonderful people in uniform. Some of the people that we see that seem to be the best and the brightest in the technology field aren't exactly the people that you imagine going to boot camp. How do we recruit in case, I mean, do we have a system in place to allow those people to serve?
So it's one of the reasons why we've tried to come up with a total force concept for us. Active, guard, reserve, civilian, contractor. That within that pool of 5 subpopulations, if you will, we can match almost any individual. Hey, I really want to get into this. I want to serve the nation, but I have no desire to deploy or be put through the physical fitness standards of the uniform. Well, boy, I'd love to work for you as a civilian. Hey, I like mobility. I'm going to try the contractor route so I can move around a little bit. We're trying to build a structure that enables us to try to attract a pretty broad swath. The positive side to me is, boy, when you get people in the team structure. I was just talking to one of the service review panels. One of the services out there has asked a party of graybeards to take a look at how they manage the cyber mission force within their service, and to answer the question, are they really optimized for the future? And I coincidentally this morning was just sitting down with this retired former chief of their service. And I said, well, you've talked to the teams, because they did that as part of their process. They said, tell me what you're hearing from them, because I have a sense, but I'm curious what you're hearing. And he said to me, the most amazing thing is every team we talk to, these men and women are so motivated and love what they're doing. I mean, that is a real plus for you. They really are into this mission, because their self-image is they are the digital warriors of the 21st century. The challenge, I think, we've got to work with the services who provide this manpower capability. How do we manage it effectively over time? And how do we also build into this the fact that we've got to acknowledge there are some areas we're going to need to do differently? We can't put a person in this once and then spend all that time training them, and then they don't do it for another 10 years. That's ridiculous to me. On the other hand, I realize that there's more than just the cyber mission force, as the services are asking themselves, how are we building a broader workforce to address cyber? So I'm working with the services about what percentage of the eligible trained population makes sense, what kind of policies we should have with respect to retouring them so we sustain some level of capability and experience over time, and we're not starting all over again every 3 years. That's one of the challenges at the moment that one service is trying to deal with. Their model, I'm trying to argue, we've got to make some changes to. We just can't afford to retrain everybody every 3 years. I just don't think that's cost effective, and it's a little demoralizing to the men and women.
I think this is going to be one of our greatest challenges going forward, and how we handle the cyber war,
right,
if you will, and not just with your issue. We hear the same thing about the drone pilots and the how dedicated they are, and how determined they are, and you know, the need for flexibility.
Yes, sir.
With where they work and the time that they work, and I recognize that from a pay scale, we're nowhere close to what they would get
Right.
benefits
But on the
from
other
that
hand-
land. So I appreciate their commitment to the country and your
Right.
commitment to the country as well.
Sir.
So, thank you.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairwoman Elise Stefanik, for your extraordinary leadership on organizing this hearing. And
Sir.
It's just an honor, Admiral, to be back with you. And we appreciate your innovative service to address the issues of cyber defense. As the former chairman of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capability, I'm keenly aware of the huge challenges that lie before us and the extraordinary men and women that you put together to serve in your command. Cyber security is a 24-hour, 30-a-day, 365-day-a-year responsibility that requires instantaneous analysis, response, and deterrence. After each cyber attack, we have the circumstance of where the government officials are grappling with whether or not it constitutes a mere nuisance or an act of war. It is for this reason I introduced the Cyber Attack Standards Measurement Study Act, H.R. 1030, which would require that a Director of National Intelligence, the Homeland Security Department, FBI, and Secretary of Defense to conduct a study to determine appropriate standards that could be used to quantify the damage of cyber incidents for the purpose of determining appropriate response. And two questions. Do you believe that there exists an interagency definition for cyber active war? And secondly, do you believe that we have a common metric to measure cyber incidents which could benefit the interagency response?
I think there's a broad, certainly in the kinetic world, there's a broad definition out there of an act of war. But even in the kinetic world, it's still somewhat situational dependent. So I fully expect that our experience in cyber is going to be something similar. It goes to one of the previous questions in some ways, articulating those concepts in a way that actors understand that you may be tripping a threshold that will trigger a response. I think that's in our best long-term interest. That helps, I think, help the nation states, actors, groups out there understand there are potential prices to pay here. And at some point, you will trip a threshold, again, depending on the scenario, and that's not a good place for you to be. We're clearly still working our way through there, and I'm not a policy guy, I'm the operational guy, so I try to figure out what do we do once the policymaker makes that determination.
And thank you for recognizing, too, it could be nation states, it could be other actors. What a challenge, and so we're so grateful for your service. One of the first challenges that you have are updating antiquated infrastructure.
Yes, sir.
I'm grateful that the district I represent is adjacent to Fort Gordon, home of the Army Cyber Command. Can you please describe the amount of infrastructure modernization that needs to occur and how the demand differs across the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines?
So as we saw, and I'll use WannaCrypt as an example, is we're working our way through the services because I have overall operational responsibility. The services physically own much. In the current network structure, the services still own much of the infrastructure. So I partner with them in attempting to address that infrastructure cybersecurity. One of the things we continue to find is we are still carrying a lot of very old infrastructure that offers potential increased vulnerability. And the defense in-depth approach we use is designed to help mitigate that. But I literally just sent a note to a service chief earlier this week and senior leaders in that service and said, look, at some point, these vulnerabilities down at the tactical level and in our acquisition world become potential points of exploitation by others that have the chance to negate some of that defense in depth. So we've got to address this. I find we've talked a lot about manpower, but in some ways, to me, the acquisition piece, that's hard. That's even harder because it's long-term, it's huge sunk costs, and it is competing against priorities like, so do you want me to buy more F-35s, additional, carriers? Do you want more brigade combat teams? In a world of finite resources, you got to make those resource trade-offs. And in general, the acquisition world hasn't historically always been incentivized for cybersecurity outcomes as its primary metric.
Well, thank you very much, and we look forward to working with Chairwoman Stefanik to back you up in every way. And
Thanks.
with my time running out, I do want to thank you for the participation by the National Guard in your efforts, and what has been the level, and what more can we do to help you in this regard?
Boy, so if you just look at Cyber Command, we have over 100 guardsmen and reserves every day supporting us. Every day we currently have guard components activated on the defensive side, on the offensive side, and some of our specialized capabilities. So the Guard is a day-to-day player for us. If you also look at what the Guard is doing from oh, sorry, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Time's expired. They're calling votes soon, so I want to get through everybody. Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Admiral, good to be with you here today. Appreciate it. What you were talking about various structures of how we set up our command and
right.
You know, where we're headed. I'm curious what our adversaries are doing. What do we know about how they're structured and looking at what they're doing and maybe guiding us in some way?
In some ways, it's kind of interesting. Again, I'm not going to get into a classified discussion, but broadly, Cyber Command is viewed as, wow, this is a really interesting concept that the U.S. has created. What can we do to attempt to emulate at least parts of it? I'm not arguing that it's perfect or that everyone else in the world wants to. But in general, I spend a lot of time talking to allies, and they'll often say to me, while we may not opt to go the same particular structure you've created, the process you went through, the capabilities you've developed, the way you've created an organizational, operational construct that's focused on generating outcomes, hey, we're really interested in doing that. Is there a way we can potentially partner? So part of Cyber Command's mission set right now is you spend a lot of time with foreign partners around the world. Now, I'm the first to acknowledge I have to prioritize here, but as part of the broader department strategy, I have prioritized different areas of the world that we're really heavily focused on right now in terms of partnership as helping those nations develop cyber capability.
Well, that's our allies, but I know you mentioned in a different setting, go into more detail what our adversaries.
Right, if I could, I'd be glad in the closed
another time.
session
That's
if I
fine.
could just
I
share some
appreciate
interesting thoughts there.
You did mention that we wanted people to know some of the things we were doing to counter ISIS, and maybe that's kind of hitting them, but a shot across the bow for others. Have you felt that it's had an effect?
I certainly hope so, because quite frankly, again, one of the reasons we opted to publicly acknowledge this was we wanted other actors to be aware that we are developing and employing, again, within a legal framework, but we are developing and employing those capabilities. There certainly is an increased awareness by some actors around the world as they look at us, as they try to study us about capabilities and kinds of things we're doing. Again, I'm not going to get into specifics, but we're certainly aware of that.
Yeah, in another setting, I might
Yes, sir.
hear more.
I'd be glad to.
Yeah, we'll have that opportunity, I'm sure. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Admiral Rogers, for your testimony. At this time, they are likely to call votes in the next couple of minutes or so. After votes are finished, we will reconvene in Rayburn 2337 upstairs for the closed portion of this. If there are additional questions from the members, please feel free to submit them for the record, and then we can anticipate a response from you. This committee is adjourned, and we will reconvene.
Thank you, ma'am.